Welcome back to the Family Ties podcast. Hi guys, Kelley Ritchie here. Thank you all for joining us today. Before we get started, we would like to invite each and every one of you to subscribe on YouTube, like our videos, and share your thoughts and comments with us. And for those of you listening to our podcast, please rate and subscribe wherever you find your pods. We welcome your feedback as well as your suggestions and case recommendations, so please post away. Hi, Brianna. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. How about you?
Good, thank you. So we are going to be revisiting the tragic death of Tyler McMillan today, a case that we covered in episode 28 of the Family Ties podcast. Check that out if you haven't already. But Brianna, would you like to introduce yourself and your connection to this?
Yeah, of course. My name is Brea Glosson. I actually go by Brea now as like an adult person. I was born and raised in North Carolina, and Tyler was a friend of mine. We were from the same homeschool organization. That's where we met and got to know each other. And we were friends. And so when he passed away, I followed the case very closely. My mom was friends with his stepmom and his dad, so that was a difficult thing to kind of process, I guess, for me and for my family. So yeah, I guess that's the basics of it.
How old were you in 2008 when he passed away?
I was 13.
Okay, so you guys are the same age. Okay, all right. So that's pretty heavy stuff to kind of experience as a 13-year-old, or I mean, I don't care what age you are. It's a terrible loss, and then the way that it happened, I would have thrown me into just a spiral. So with that being said, just walk us through, that period first. We'll start at the end and then work back. What parts do the media get right and what parts do they get wrong when it comes to this case and how it's covered?
Let's see. I think first off, I would say that they don't spend enough time and attention focusing on two things. One would be homeschooling and the regulations and what that looks like, how that can affect how a child is treated, especially like with the laws in North Carolina. It's a pretty lax state when it comes to homeschooling policy. So there's not enough people checking in on us, those of us who were homeschooled. And I think the second part is the relationship between the parents. So I guess to give you a little bit of information about that, both his mom and his dad had been married before, and they were both widows. Their spouses had died. And so they met each other online through virtual dating, and they connected. Sandy lived in Florida and Bryce lived in North Carolina, his family still. And so they connected over their shared faith. They connected over having lost a spouse. And psychologists who reviewed the case during the court proceedings kind of decided that it was what you would call like a toxic relationship, being that maybe neither one of them would be an abuser, maybe neither one of them would be malicious or have bad intention, but together they amplify those negative qualities in each other, which really made them take out their frustrations on their kids through what they thought was doing right to raise them up.
Right. Now, you mentioned two other children in the house. I don't think that we covered anything like that. I don't think that many of the news stories had any information there. So I think we just kind of sidestepped around it. But tell us about those two kids and what ended up happening there.
Yeah, so I'm not going to use their names because I feel like this is a chapter that they would want, that should be in their own hands should they choose to.
Absolutely.
Talk about it. But the two younger siblings, one was Tyler's brother, one was his stepsister. They were both younger. I think at the time they were around like the stepsister was 9 and the brother was probably 11. And so they, for a hot second, actually, this is like pretty strange to think back on, right when Tyler went into the hospital before he was announced as dead, his stepmom called my mom and asked her to take care of the two younger kids because they were friends. And so she was like, hey, can you take care of the kids? Tyler's in the hospital. We didn't know any other information. So she went to go pick them up. And when she went to go pick them up is when they arrested Sandy, actually. So because my mom couldn't take them at that time, they went into like social services. They were through the DSS. They ended up going to their like their families to be raised. So Tyler's little brother was raised, I think, for the most part by his like maternal family. So his mom's like mother. And the sister went back to Florida, where she was originally from, and was raised, I think, by her mom's parents.
Wow. I can't even imagine being one of the siblings. I mean, usually, and I don't know if this is actually scientifically backed, but usually in a household with like multiple kids and abuse, sometimes it's rare, but sometimes one gets singled out for the most abuse. Now, I mean, in my home life, everybody was getting it. But I did see a pattern of one more than the other. But in this case, do you think the other two, did you guys have any indication of what was going on in the household, or were they really good at just presenting a united and seemingly wholesome front?
Yeah, hindsight is 2020, you know. So for years I was, you know, as like a teenager, I was haunted by things that looking back, I was like, oh, that was probably like a sign that I should have been aware of, but I was not. Especially when you're in like a conservative Christian homeschool environment, a lot of times people are very authoritarian. There is a lot of um, creative punishments, for lack of better terms.
Hmm.
So there were times like we went over to his house because my mom wanted to drop something off that they needed, or like bring some food or something. And Tyler would be sitting there like on the porch reading a book, and he would be allowed to like talk to me and we could talk and chat for a while, but he wasn't allowed to like go inside. And there was an awkward atmosphere. Like looking back now, I can think of that. There would be a couple of times when he would like be dropped off to come to youth group with me, because that's, you know, how you socialize back
Hmm.
then. And he would like be dropped off, and then right after, like his parents would come pick him up, not 10 minutes later, just
Hmm.
like change their minds and bring him back. So little things like that. As far as signs of physical abuse, I never noticed anything. Um, and other than like those times, those moments, he was a really like happy person. He was really outgoing. He told a lot of jokes. He was pretty like silly. Um, so it's not like you could tell by his demeanor. As far as the younger two go, I believe that they did not have as much, if any, similar punishments. I
Hmm.
wasn't in them, so I can't say for certain. But
Yeah.
I do think that part of that was when you are a teenager, especially, you know, 13, 14, in a situation like this, anytime that you're grappling with that, anytime that you're hormonal, anytime that you stand up for yourself, you're probably going to be met with a little bit of resistance from your parents. So I
Hmm.
think part of it's his age. I think part of it's the situation, him being the oldest one. And I also think that he was the person who would stand up for his siblings to kind of distract from them so that he would take the brunt of anything.
Right. And that's kind of the case with my oldest sister as well. Um, and it is interesting just kind of peeking at other families from, a point or a vantage point of not knowing them personally and being able to pick up on some weird behavior. But it only, I think, unless you grew up in a really oppressively conservative or religious homeschooling environment, you're not really going to register those things. You're going to be like, oh, that's just an awkward homeschool behavior. But a lot of it, there are some warning signs that you can see with certain kids. Now, Tyler, I specifically wrote down that I wanted you to tell me as much as you could about Tyler because I wanted you to paint us a picture of what he was like. So he's funny, he's the jokester, but I feel like this is something that's really missing in most of these cases because, news and media channels don't really have that inside glimpse of who that victim was. And it's like, perpetrators end up being the ones that we talk about the most. So I'm interested in more of your relationship with Tyler and what you remember of him.
Yeah, of course. So Tyler and I were both in the same homeschool organization. It was like a homeschool, like emotional support group, I suppose, which also had a couple of co-ops, like a big co-op where a whole bunch of families showed up, and like some smaller ones with just a couple families. And we also like went to the same youth group. So as much socialization as we got in like those like pretty typical like homeschool socialization ways, we saw each other. He was very funny, lighthearted. He wanted to be a writer, so he wrote sometimes. He wrote like a short story when we were on a youth group retreat in one of my notebooks because he asked to borrow it, and I have spent years trying to find it after he passed. I have not been able to find it, unfortunately, but yeah, he really was easygoing and easy to get along with. He was pretty new to our group when he passed. He'd been there for maybe 8 months or so, 9 months. But like as soon as he came in, like he and I clicked really well. We had kind of a little friend group of like 2 or 3 of us sometimes, but we clicked in that even by like homeschool standards, we were kind of the unusual ones. Him being new, and even though I had been a part of that group for like, I don't know, 7 years at that point, I was into like theater and things that were not as popular. So we just got along really well in being a little bit different.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned your mom and the 2 kids. So did she actively pursue getting custody, or was it just that initial like taking them for the mom or the stepmom?
So I guess the easiest way to answer that would be kind of recount the events of that day as best as I remember them, which granted it has been many years now, but things that are traumatic kind of stick with you a little bit differently, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So I was at a co-op class, and my mom had dropped me off, and she called one of the parents whose like house I was at, to let me know that Tyler was sick and he was going into the hospital, and so his 2 siblings would be spending the night with us. And we lived in a pretty like rural part of our town. We have a pretty small town. There's a university there, so there's like some stuff, but then we live like far out, kind of in the sticks. So like the organization of that, I guess, was what she was calling me about. And then my like dad picked me up on his way home from work, and then my mom didn't come back until hours later. And when she came back, she told me that she was supposed to go get the 2 kids. They showed up kind of in between their houses at like in the middle location, because he lived also kind of out in the middle of nowhere, but like, yeah, a lot of farm country in North Carolina.
Yeah.
And so when she pulled up, like not long after the police showed up, so like my younger brothers saw her being like handcuffed and taken away, saw the kids being taken away. And my mom initially, I think in that time, pursued trying to get custody of the 2 kids. But after that, I think she was shocked and not understanding enough of the system to know, I think, the next steps to take to be there.
So now here's a question. Now, I don't know about your personal homeschool experience. I don't know if it's anywhere as, I mean, all I can say to describe my experience is just think of the Duggar family. Just think of the Duggars and you've got a picture, except not as wholesome. If that's even still something people think of them, but
I get what you're putting down. Yeah.
In that kind of environment, if let's just say the roles reversed and my mom was going to go, they would have thought, it was the government coming to take their kids away from them. Wouldn't have really jumped to any conclusion that there might have been something that the parents could have done wrong. It would have been one of those things to make us fearful as kids, like, see, this will happen to you if people catch us with you guys outside of school. And my parents did try and put those fears in our heads. Was there pretty a simple just coming to terms with the facts of what happened go on in your family, or were there a lot of questioning?
So when the police showed up to arrest Sandy is when my mom found out that Tyler had passed away. And I guess they had like let her leave the scene because he was being taken to the hospital. But then once he passed, they were like, we have to go get her. I think because she found out that situation, I think that for a while, because that had been her friend, and you don't want to know somebody capable of hurting another person that deeply.
Yeah.
So for a long time, or for at least a while, I think that there was a processing that was kind of like, oh, well, maybe it was like a really bad accident. We don't know what was happening. Like, we don't know the details. Maybe it was just something that like went horribly wrong, like from what they had planned for it to be. And so my mom has never been the type of person to be afraid of the government per se. But for me, like the idea of being put into public school was like the big bad wolf. That was the thing, more than like the government taking us away. I don't think that was even on her radar. It was more like, if you're bad, you're going to have to go to public school and they're going to stab you and you're going to learn about evolution.
Oh boy, what's scarier than evolution? I can't think of anything. But
tank tops.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Spaghetti straps? Oh boy,
No.
No. Now as far as the co-op goes, now I don't think that so my parents early on were involved with our local homeschool group until and they were big Gothardites, Quiverful movement, like full on. And then my mom, who it's so interesting just to look at the dichotomies of homeschooling then versus now, because so much has changed, which I'm really comforted by. But she was such a strong woman. I don't know why she can't really realize she's an actual feminist, but she was always very outspoken. She would have arguments with our ministers, with the male leaders, and she was supposed to be that, docile wife and mother. And so, we weren't really welcome in these groups because of how bold and in your face she was. And, it was her way or the highway. So it's so bonkers to me that she survived as long as she did in a movement like the Quiverful movement, because that's not a woman's role at all. But how were the vibes of the community that you guys were in? Because it seems like a co-op is a nice way for everybody to do some socialization, to learn from other parents, or so were there full-on classes that you went to?
Yes. So it was like the big co-op, I guess is what we called it, was like a once a week thing. I think it was on like Fridays. I don't know. But you would have like 4 or 5 periods in the day. You could sign up for classes that other moms would teach. My mom's background is in art education, so she would always teach an art class and kind of like trade off. So like, your kid can take my art class for free, and like my kid will take your math class. So it was a good opportunity to socialize. Our group at its like peak, which was I guess when I was in high school, had 140 families.
Wow. Okay.
A lot of people in like East North Carolina are big into the homeschool situation. And of course, 140 homeschool families means that there's on average, I'd say like 7 kids. Some of them are like 13 and some of them are like, we have 1 kid and he's perfect. My family, we had 3 and 3 was enough for us because like my dad didn't make a lot of money. And so my brothers and I shared a bedroom for a very long time. Like 3 was arguably too many. I love them both with my whole heart, but We were not quiverful. I don't think we could have handled that. So I'm glad we were not. But our homeschool group had a decent population of like Mormons, a decent population of Baptists. That's what a lot of people were, some non-denominational Christians. Everybody had to be Christian and had to sign a statement of faith.
Yep.
That said, like, Jesus is the Son of God. He rose for your sins, like a pretty basic one, so that the Mormons could agree with it. And because there's a large population of Latter-day Saints in our area. But it was so that like they could agree with it, and non-denominational and the Baptists could. Although there were differences, there were those who believed like you have to speak in tongues to go to heaven. We had like 1 or 2 Catholic families over the years, and that was pretty big. That made a lot of waves, so many waves. But we did, because not all evangelical Christians believe that Catholics are Christian.
Right.
That one was a big deal. But it was a lot of, for like a microcosm of this thing, it was a lot of different viewpoints, it felt at the time. Now
That's
I'm
actually a very diverse crowd to be around,
right?
Really, because, in rural Kentucky, part of the reason, you kind of wish that the reason people were homeschooling in communities like yours and mine would be because of how spread out everybody is. You're not necessarily close to a good school. So it just makes more sense to homeschool and to really, give them the best chance that they can at a good education. Unfortunately, in the past, and it sounds like in your group, most people did homeschool for religious reasons. But with that being said, the group I was in would not have allowed Mormons or Catholics at all. It was pretty, that whole mindset of my way or the highway. And, forget it if you're LGBTQ, not allowed. Don't even talking about them. So it's just so interesting to see how the tides are shifting. And I think that's the encouraging part, is like seeing how many more families are homeschooling for non-religious reasons. How do you feel like your education, like overall, the quality of it, were they able to give you like 3 kids isn't a lot. So it sounds like you could probably get,
a lot. I have a very complicated relationship with my education. There were parts of it, I think I spent a lot of my life when I was younger, and I'm guessing you did too, almost defending being homeschooled, because it's like you're taught that,
Yep.
Oh, you were homeschooled, like, do you even know how to talk to people? And it's like, yes, I'm adjusted, like I socialize, I hang out with people, youth group, I talk to them, I can read, write, and do arithmetic, like what more do you want from me? So I spent a long time, even in college, almost defending it, because I got tired of being like the weird one. So I felt like I had to like come in hot, like I'm valid and worth being here, even though I was homeschooled, because my education was great. Now I am in a different phase of my life where I'm more willing to openly criticize it. And I'm an educator, so I also know kind of policies and the norms and what most people learn at what age is. So I can say there are some pretty big gaps in my knowledge. I never took geography, so I have a very loose understanding of where things are in the world. I didn't take a lot of history classes that went past like Civil War history. So anything modern, I have had to pick up on my own. And that's not even getting into anything cultural of my upbringing, like, I don't know, Backstreet Boys, like things that I wasn't allowed to, read or participate in, that I've had to cover ground for, just educational stuff. When I was in high school, I did online classes through an online Christian, like homeschool thing, school, I guess, that is geared towards missionaries' kids mostly, or it was originally. They're still active from what I know. I think that it's just they're pretty popular. It was in Kathy Duffy's top 100 homeschool picks. That's how my mom found everything. So, so it was like a big deal. So in high school, I was like classically educated after the Greeks classical, which meant that like my history tied into my English. So we were reading stuff that was from the same time period as we were learning about in history. And at the same time, I was taking classes on rhetoric, worldview, and logic, like propositional logic. So breaking things down into syllogisms. And to be frank, after Tyler died, a few months later, sorry if you can hear this, New York,
okay.
but
okay.
After Tyler passed a couple months later, between my home life and just, other like teenage drama, I really spiraled into what was later diagnosed as like PTSD. At the time, it was just like very deep depression is what it felt like. So I had a very rocky relationship with school. Up until then, I'd always been like the smart one. I loved reading and I loved history. But I just couldn't really do any work. So I spent a lot of time just looking at like Word documents and not being able to type anything. And my teachers, the one who was the head of my program, advocated for me to stay in, even though I was not passing my classes, because they were like, hey, you're safe here. And like, we can watch her here and know that she's okay. And like, know that she's like, yeah, she's depressed, but like that she's like safe emotionally. Because of course, like public school, I'd be fed to the wolves. And, oh no. And so it came from goodness in her heart. But looking back, I'm like, would I have been better off in public school? Probably. But at the time, it felt like they were taking care of me at a time that I really craved adults who were sticking their necks out for me and who were taking care of me. So I was raised to be like part of the next generation of like the Christian homeschool army. So a lot of that education was very much like, we have to prove that we're right and that, we're young earth creationists. How dare you think anything else? Like discovering creation through whatever it was with Jay Weil, like all of that.
Talk to me about that because, coming from a very creationist family, I was pen pals with Ken Ham for a number of years as a kid. We went to all the conferences. And then at one point, his secretary responded to one of my letters and said he didn't have time to respond personally anymore. It broke my heart. And then years down the road, it just, the tables flipped. And then I saw Bill Nye debate him, which I wish he hadn't have done. But it's so interesting coming from it. And like, do you feel like the world is nothing but like something that you're trying to soak in, like science and like real science? You're like, there's so much cool stuff to learn.
Yes. I pretty often make the joke with my close friends. I'm like, wow, we live in the future. Because it feels like part of me, I feel like I was raised in kind of the 50s, with like the things that I was allowed to listen to and watch in my formative years and the viewpoints that I was allowed to observe and to learn about and to like, I was raised to argue on behalf of,
Yes.
And so getting to be an adult and be free of that and to recognize like, I think the first step for me was being able to say like, hey, other people have different opinions and that's okay. Like my relationship with feminism was very much like, oh, like these other women can have rights and be like liberated and that's okay. Like that's great for them. And then the next stage was like, I can have rights and be liberated. Like, oh, hold on. Like that's pretty exciting.
Yeah. It's such a weird journey. And I think it is so important to have people who have experienced both sides and can, sit there with all that knowledge and be like, okay, so fact is actually way cooler and stranger than fiction that I was brought up on. And regardless of what you think, you may still be super religious, and that's fine. I've gone the completely opposite direction, but I honestly wouldn't even say that my upbringing had anything to do with where I am now spiritually, because I think I would have ended up here anyways with, the brain that I have. But when you're in an environment like that, like the co-op that you went to, what are the sciences like? What, because there's only
So
so much you can talk about.
it was, I brought up the name Jay Weil, and I have a weird relationship with that in my mind because I respect him a lot as a person. He substitute taught for my online class a few times, which made me feel famous because he wrote the textbooks that I used in like 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade for science. So I felt like he's a celebrity. We're Facebook friends. He does community theater, which
Hey.
hits like a very sweet spot in my heart. But you know, the things that he believes, I disagree with, and they are things that I was taught to an extreme. And so a lot of the texts and a lot of the way that we were raised was like, science wants you to think this, but really it's this. Like if you've seen the video of like Bill Nye going to the Creation Museum,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very like, he's like, this doesn't make any sense. This is nonsense. How can you say this? And he's like, well, because the Bible is the truth. And so if your jumping off point for science is the Bible, and I don't say this to go against anybody who's religious. There are people that I love very much who are religious still. But, you know, if your jumping off point for science is the Bible and taking it literally, then you're going to have problems when it comes to the real world. I really love the interpretation that a lot of Catholic people actually have of the Bible and Jewish people, which is like Genesis is poetry. Like it's not literal, which is why they can affirm things like evolution, which blew my mind because I didn't think that you could be Christian and believe in evolution, but you can.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's like a really neat way to consolidate those pieces. But when you're raised the way that I was, it's very much like God created everything. Look, the human eye, isn't that so neat? Nothing could have happened by accident like that, so it must be God. Like anything we learned was glorify God.
Yes.
And so there were pieces that were missing. There were pieces that I only, like pieces of the ideas of evolution that I only learned almost to refute it. And so there's a lot that I still learn. And when I learn it, I get a little excited and often very embarrassed if it's in a public situation. Or if I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. Oh.
I have no shame in saying, oh, wow, this is the first time I've heard of this. And before bringing this conversation back to a couple other questions that I have about Tyler, I, the other night, watched something that may have sort of been the closest to a religious experience that I will have. And it was watching this thing on Netflix. I've been wanting to watch it for a while, and then Netflix got it, and I was so excited. But it's Fantastic Fungi.
Oh, I heard about that. I have a weird thing about mushrooms, so I could not watch that. I don't like looking at them. Like shelf mushrooms.
It is just what they are. I never knew they were their own species. I thought they were plants. So just everything about it, I was like, this is incredible. And just what their purpose is and what it does and how intelligent it is. It's like, I think learning about the world is the coolest thing. So I'm not like afraid to be like, hey, I don't know the first thing about it. Let's learn about it. I want to see. I want to know. So I think it's kind of fun at this stage in life.
I love it. I'm at the place in my life for the first time where I'm willing to acknowledge that I don't have the answers to everything. Because I think when you do grow up in a conservative Christian background, it's very much like you have to have faith in the Lord. Like doubt is a very big no-no. Like you have to know like what you believe about certain things, and if you don't, then you're not a real Christian. Or if you know what you believe and it's wrong, then you're not.
Anyway, yeah.
So it's very much like, you know, I am, you know, like I was like a young earth, like 7-day creationist, very literally, like that's what I had to believe. A friend invited me to his church and I was like, well, are they Reformed? Are they Calvinist? Like, what is the deal here? And he's like, I don't know. And I was like, then what are you even doing in church? Like, you don't know. And so now there are a lot of pieces of things that it's like, I don't have to know the answer to that anymore. Like, do I believe in evolution? Yes, but is it the thing that like I will fight to the death over? no, I don't care enough. That's not something. I'm so much more invested in learning about the way the world is now, people, how their brains work, um, people's motivations. I'm way more interested in learning about like the science that I can see, taste, touch, smell,
Mm-hmm.
like that I can see and access than I am about like thinking about things that happened a very, very long time ago.
Yeah. Well, you may not like mushrooms. I don't like eating them. I refuse to eat them, but just do yourself a favor. Give it a little shot. A
I'll give
few
it a
minutes.
try.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Now as far as Tyler's the impact of his death on you, you mentioned some side effects of like PTSD, some depression. That's all very natural. How did your family view mental health comes up a lot when we talk about homeschooling and what people like the people I grew up around believe about mental health, seeing as my mom
Yeah,
is extremely mentally ill and will never get better and will never seek a doctor's help, which is why I'm on antidepressant medications. I take it very seriously. Finally, in the first time of my life, I feel like it's okay to like care about myself. Does that make
yeah,
sense?
of course. Yeah. I kind of had the double-edged sword of having parents who both are mentally ill people, and who knew that and were willing to stand against people who, like, Christian pray it away. They met in art school in college. They were like burning records and burning cassette tapes that they didn't want to listen to, but they also were like painting at a very like pretty liberal school.
Yeah.
Um, they're kind of anomalies in a couple ways like that. So they're both big feelers. They both had pretty serious depression. When I was younger, my mom like had a really hard time getting out of bed for a couple weeks at a time. Which looking back on it now, I'm like, we were home alone with an adult who wasn't able to take care of herself, let alone us. Like there should have been somebody involved. But the flip side of that is they have both been like medicated for a mental illness. They've both had a relationship with mental health where they're willing to talk about it. So they did their best to help. They sent me to their marriage therapist, their counselor, to go get therapy, which was a bad idea. And so I that kind of kickstarted a long period in my life where I went to many different therapists and tried many different medications until I was about 17, and then I just wanted to be fixed. I was very tired of trying things that I felt like weren't working. I had a wonderful therapist who I loved very dearly, but I was like, I just want to be able to move on with my life. So I made it through college not having any help with any sort of medication. I did not thrive. I survived. I should have stayed. I was like, I can go to class and I can turn in things, so I'm good. But like, I was not always enjoying it. I really did struggle. And so after I graduated, I went back to the therapist that I had when I was like 17. And I had her until I moved to New York, so for a couple more years. So I was lucky in that I did have parents who were willing to believe me when I said that I felt really sad and couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
I kind of became the spokesperson for mental health in my homeschool group amongst my peers. I had a lot of people who would be like, I feel sad. Am I depressed? Should I be medicated? And I'd be like, well, I'm not a therapist, but probably.
Yeah.
And they're like, my mom doesn't believe in it. And I'm like, I don't know how to help you. I'm not a therapist. I'm sorry. That sucks.
Yeah. I do think that it's a huge thing in specifically the religious community everybody thinks that, to fix something, all you need to do is pray. And, for
have faith.
Yep, have faith. And it's not necessarily something to medicate. And
that's what I saw a lot of in my spiritual community. I had a lot of people that within like 6 months of Tyler passing, they were like, we're tired of seeing you like not smile, just be happy. Like, just why can't you just be happy? Like, you're not putting your faith in the Lord. Maybe you have to look at the sin in your life that's causing this. And I was like, I'm pretty sure it's not sin. I'm pretty sure it's all of this other stuff, like
Feelings,
dying
empathy.
and, you know,
Yeah.
all these other things.
Grief. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that's my other question is his death. What I struggle with, and I struggle with this for each and every case that I've been looking into, is if it happened any time in the past, like there are no updated stories since on the like the news on Tyler or any kind of remembrance since like 2008 or even 2013 is like the most recent thing I saw. And it shocks me because that was a life. That was a someone's life. And for a community that I grew up in that treasures life to such a degree, um, all life is precious, except when you're 18, go into the military, die, whatever, it doesn't matter. Or basically, once you're born, it no
Or when you're
longer
a Democrat.
matters. Yeah, exactly. Basically, once you're out of the womb, it no longer matters. How can we, coming from that background, educate people who we disagree with entirely on how to view children and treat children and view that life as still being just as precious as it was in the womb?
Oh, that's a good but a big question. Um, I think when it comes to dealing with the loss of a child in a small community like mine, it's the awkward kind of thing where, like, because it's a pretty small town, if I ever like talk to people about it and was like, hey, if if I'm messed up, like if you're noticing this pattern, this is part of why. Like if I have to like go into this whole narrative, I have to talk about it. And I say have to. But like when it does come up with people who don't know, a lot of times if they're from my hometown, they're like, oh my God, like I knew him. I went to school with him when he was in Christian school. Like my roommate, who was a good friend of mine, she went to like Christian school with him in kindergarten and first grade. Like it's a small place.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it felt so senseless to them. They didn't want to think about it too much.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the dissonance that comes with that. I think that if you talk about violence done in your community, in your Christian conservative community, then you have to start thinking, oh, is there other violence in this safe place that I exist in?
Mm-hmm.
Are there other kids who are hurting and who are being abused? And the answer is most likely yes. Yes, probably, yeah. So I think that the best way to carry on the memory of Tyler, the memory of other kids who died in these like abusive, specifically like, you know, homeschooled tragic cases, has to be vigilance in the adults in the community, education for the adults and the kids to know the signs of abuse, to know what to look for, like that weird interaction, like when he gets picked up and then immediately taken from church. You need to look for not only like, oh, this is a weird thing, but now what? What can I do without the fear of the government coming in and ruining homeschool for all of us, which was like, you know, why people didn't want to report the other cases that I knew that there were kids who were not getting fair education. I knew that there were people who were being treated poorly by their parents. And as a kid, I felt helpless.
Mm-hmm.
But looking back and as an adult, they could have been reported. They should have been reported by the other parents.
Well, and if you think about it in that light, we were also raised in a time and space where what was happening next door was that family's business.
Mm-hmm.
It was their business. It was a family issue. Don't get involved. And I think education is huge. Educating people on the right. I mean, isn't it crazy that you have little kids who finally in the industrial age were finally recognized as being like not just little adults, Like they have different agency, they have like different patterns of behavior, all of this stuff that we're still so behind the trend in like figuring out that kids have and deserve rights as well. And
yes, and
we
that one
view
of those
them,
is the right to the education.
yeah,
Absolutely. That blew my mind when I learned about that in college in one of my like education courses, because that's what I went to school for, which is when I learned about, I think when I started to unpack how different the experience of homeschoolers tend to be, was when I was learning about like how all of these moms pushed so that their kids, regardless of physical or mental differences, deserved an equal education. And that blew my mind. And so I think that it's hard for some people to come to terms with, because they're afraid of their rights being taken away, right? That's what we're all afraid of all the time. It's like our guns, our freedom being stolen from us. And I think that that's why people don't want to speak out often. With my community, it wasn't so much like, oh, it's that family's business, because there were a bunch of like real nosy moms in my group. It was more like, if we tell social services on that homeschool family, then all homeschool families suffer. And we're the ones, not the bad ones. And so then they'll make more rules. But the rules for North Carolina homeschooling, like to get into specific policy, are just like, you have to send in a notice of intent saying like, we're going to be a school and this is our name. Ours was like Shepherd Heart Homeschool. After that, the person who provides instruction has to have a high school degree or equivalent, which is not very much.
No.
High school is precious. That information that you get is precious. But to educate other people, absolutely not. That's not enough. You have to have a regular schedule for 9 months, which just means 180 days of education.
And who's checking on that? You just
check it off on a form.
Yeah. Like,
we went totally to the aquarium and they were like, oh, that's school.
Yep.
We went on a field trip of Cold Stone Creamery. That's school for the day. And you have to record attendance and immunization records. That doesn't mean you have to have your kid immunized anyway. You just have to record it. But there's a record there.
Now,
and you have to do a standardized test. You don't have to pass it, but you have to do it.
North Carolina, then, with those low standards, they're middling. That was more than was required. So, I mean, I think there's like the high standards or middle or low, and the low regulations for Kentucky isn't even the lowest. Like, so we were still considered middling, because you have places like Mississippi where you don't even have to give that letter of intent. You don't have to. I know for a fact that all my mom ever had to do was just report that we were homeschooling. That was it. We never had test records, nothing. I mean, like the ACT was the first test I took. And that's a whole other ballgame in and of itself. But it's, I think, one of those things that is going to be the hardest thing to make any progress in is getting them on board with being accountable to somebody, because it's always the government. It's always evil, the evil controlling government. But
I think to do that, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go for it.
I think to do that, it would take a lot of, you would have to be able to connect and appeal to the hearts of people like the HSLDA, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, people who are making the policies for the states, people who are looking at what are the bare minimum requirements that we can get away with, and let's argue for that on the sake of people's freedom. Because they're the ones that are in the room advocating for the homeschoolers. And so they need to have people who are there to advocate for the children in the homeschool families.
Yeah. I mean, the last thing I'll say about it, because I know we're wrapping up, is in my mind, there really should be some kind of established group, like watchdog group, that, has its feelers in all the organizations over the states. And there's someone who reports to them over the well-being of all the people within that group. all the kids within that group, the health of the families. I mean, that's a lot for one person in a group to do, but something where
there are resources.
Yes.
There are resources. I think that you're absolutely right. I think that, like, logically, in my opinion, the best thing to do would be like a different branch of DSS, one that specifically works with homeschool families, showing up to the houses on random school days. Are these kids doing school? Where is their book? Somebody who is like you or I, like, informed on what homeschooling looks like, who can use the language, what is your curriculum? What's your curriculum for math, for reading, for history? Let me see it, let me know. So that they can make sure that the children are being treated how they deserve and are being given the education that they deserve.
Agreed. And I don't want people to think that I don't think homeschooling should be allowed. My best friend, we've been friends since I was 2 years old. From Kentucky. She's still in Kentucky. She homeschools her kids. She's a fantastic mom. I love her to death, and I support her decision to do that. But we've also talked pretty extensively about how I think we don't do enough to ensure their protection, even if I know she's great and I think that she's doing her best. Sometimes
and that's the thing, for every person like your friend who's doing a great job, there are 5 that are not doing right by their kids. And so it's one of those things where, yes, it might feel like more hoops for a good homeschool person to jump through. And just like I would never shame or judge anybody for being religious, I would never shame or judge anybody for homeschooling if that's their choice, so long as they are doing it in a healthy way and doing what they need to.
Yeah, I register my car. I have a driver's license. Maybe I should be angry about that. I don't know. Who needs rules? But
you're on the radar.
They know about me. You being an educator, so are you a teacher?
Yes.
So what do you do? Like what level?
That's a great
grade?
Question. So I graduated with a degree in theater education, because I was like, oh, I should marry my high school boyfriend and be subservient to him and be a teacher, because even though theater is my love, I also am passionate about learning. And so that's something that I can do and fall in line with him. And then I did not do that. And I'm in New York pursuing acting, going to school to be an actor.
Get it.
Thanks. But in the meantime, I also am still really passionate about education. So I teach. This is going to sound crazy. I actually work as a homeschool educator. So I work through a company where I have a boss who is very knowledgeable about all of the New York policies and laws. And his job is to make sure that the kids are getting their needs met. And then I implement the curriculum that he plans. I plan my own curriculum. But it's nice because it's a team effort. The family's very non-traditional in that they travel the world for part of the year and go on their yacht sometimes, and they fly off to a different country. And so I guess traditional school doesn't really fit their lifestyle. Therefore, me and one other person work with the 3 kids who are 6, 8, and 9 to teach them. So I still homeschool.
That's cool though, because I mean, your experience I think is vital in knowing what kids need. And with that being said, if you had a gaggle of children, if you just had a hypothetical gaggle of children, do you, as someone who now is an educator, think or feel confident in teaching all of those kids simultaneously different grade levels? Is that something that is actually feasible?
No, I work with 3 children. I am one of 2 teachers who is in the room working with 3 kids. And sometimes that's difficult enough because they're at such different levels. I mean, think about what you learn between 1st and 2nd grade. Like in math, that's the difference between adding 1 + 1 or adding 9 + 1 and adding 2-digit, 3-digit numbers together. You learn a lot. So how can I teach both kids? It's very tricky. So I'm not only would I probably not homeschool multiple children, I am an advocate for homeschooling if that's your need. But I think that public school systems are beautiful. I think that there are teachers who are very passionate and very educated, who work hard. So if you live in an area with a good public school and you want to work and you want your kids to go to that school, great, do it. If you're a very passionate, resourceful educator and you want to teach your kids, do it. Just make sure that you get your needs met and that your kids get their needs met. That's all I would say.
And I do agree. I think not just public schools, but I think co-ops. I love the idea of co-ops. I would have loved that for myself because I have such a bad relationship with mathematics. Because of my mom, I still like feel such deep rooted anxiety about it. Like I'm not even going to discuss it, but or discuss it too deeply. But it's one of those things where co-ops, I think, should be a mandatory thing for homeschool families to be a part of, so that their kid can actually. I love the idea of people being able to teach something that they're really, really good at, really passionate about, and that's their thing. They don't necessarily have to teach all these different subjects to all these different grade levels. I think that co-ops are important in that way. So
exactly, and that's why I'll say like a good educator is a resourceful educator. So if you're calling us to teach your children, great, but be resourceful. Find somebody to teach your weak points, because no person is good at everything. Mm-hmm. Make sure that they're doing stuff. I did like a nonprofit children's theater, which is why I am here doing what I love to do now. But that was my socialization, and it was safe because we did like kid-friendly plays. It was mostly my people there, but like give your kids the outlets that they need, because that's what they deserve. And if you love your kids, you want to make sure that they have those needs met.
Agreed. Perfect. Beautifully said. And thank you for your insight into Tyler. I wish I could know at least one person associated with every one of these kids, just because I think it's really vital that we don't let them fall through the cracks and be forgotten, especially the circumstances in which they were so brutally taken from the world. I think it is something that everybody knows John Benet Ramsey's name. Like, and I get it, that's tragic, but there are thousands and thousands and thousands upon cases of kids in situations that we'll never even know about that end up severely brutalized, beaten, or killed. And so I think we all need to start realizing that, some of these cases are super popular to talk about, but there are so many kids who deserve to have their names mentioned and be remembered. So thank you for that.
That's why your work is so important, because you're doing that. You're the only person that I have seen, because I check pretty regularly, I like Google Tyler's name and I'm looking at what's being said and what's being done. And not many people are doing the work to research or discuss it at all. So the fact that you're doing that work, the fact that for anybody like me who knows a Tyler or who knew a Tyler, that there are ways where even if you don't publicly always keep their name alive, you can keep their spirit alive through advocacy. Yeah. Through, advocating for the next generation, that people like his siblings or people like my nieces and nephews have, better futures and better choices for them.
We're not going to let our experiences go to waste. So I appreciate your time, and hopefully you want to talk again sometime.
I would love that.
Would you? That would be fantastic.
Yes. I feel like a good kindred spirit. Anytime.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'll let you go for now. Have a good rest of your day, okay?
Thanks so much. You too.
Lovely meeting you.
Meet you.
Bye.